Hi and welcome to our Connecting Bath panel. I'm Steve Hilton and I am going to chair the discussion today. I'll start by telling you who I have here on the panel with me. I have Emily Savage from the Digital Catapult, Clayton Nash from City Fibre, Simon Martin from Bath and North East Somerset Council, and Kate Pullinger from Bath Spa University and the Creative Clusters programme. So my panellists will introduce themselves shortly, but I'm just going to set the scene for the discussion to follow. So this week we published a report that Kate and the Creative Clusters programme commissioned. We called it Connecting Bath, bringing the city up to speed with cutting-edge digital connectivity. We talked about cutting-edge connectivity deliberately, rather than pegging the conversation on a particular technology. We feel that there's value in being at the cutting edge. It's the space often where innovation happens. If you have more bandwidth than you're used to or than you know what to do with, then it leads to experimentation. So we were interested in that idea that within Bath there might be the opportunity to give, for example, creative technology businesses access to cutting-edge digital connectivity. So in the report, we started by exploring the idea of private networks for creative and technology businesses. This is a new trend, or a recent trend, within the telecoms industry. So there's a lot of investment going into upgrading the public digital network within the UK, and Clayton City Fibre are excellent examples of that. But alongside that, there's an interest in the idea of private networks to create bespoke connectivity environments for places like airports, shopping centres, hospitals, university campuses. And we were interested in whether that type of model had a place in Bath. The answer that we got was yes. We think that there is a real opportunity around having this type of bespoke connectivity for high-end creative technology businesses. But the other answer we got was you can't only think about that. You have to think about all the other businesses and users of connectivity in the city. And the idea of a private network has to sit within a broader strategy for the place. So we looked at case studies from other areas, and we drew together a framework of 5 different ways that places tend to take forward their ambitions around digital connectivity. In some places, they leave it to the market. They'd feel that there's no real need for the public sector to become involved. In fact, some participants in our interviews were very clear that they felt the public sector should stay well out of it, and it was really a matter for the private sector to make that type of investment. We heard some cities talk about being smart cities, where they bring together groups within their city in order to look at Internet of Things and advanced ways of monitoring and managing the city's environment. We heard about areas that focus in on a venue-led approach. And I'm hoping that Emily will tell us about some of the work that she's been involved with in Brighton, where the Dome in Brighton has created a whole innovation programme using advanced connectivity. We heard about research and development test beds. Ben Woods from the University of Bath was very eloquent in terms of making the case for the value of research and development networks in the city. And finally, it was a smaller part of what we heard, but the idea of neighbourhood-based digital test beds or digital projects were very exciting. We talked about Knoll West Media Centre in Bristol, which has really led a fantastic visionary approach to using advanced connectivity in the neighbourhood setting. Now, it would be tempting to conclude that what Bath needs to do is to pick from that menu and to do one of those things. But what we conclude in the report is that it's more a matter of doing all of those things. If you want to build a interconnected, creative, digital ecosystem, which Bath, I believe, does, then you need to think about how to act in all of those domains and bring those people together, because that's where you get the added benefit and value. We conclude the report with some practical suggestions for Bath about how that might look. But what I'm keen that we discuss today is more the principles around what cutting-edge digital connectivity means for cities such as Bath. So, I will, in a second, invite each of my panellists to give us some opening remarks. Following that, we'll spend 20 minutes or so discussing the issues between us. I will then open up the panel to answer any questions that come in via the web. So if you wish to submit some questions in the chat box online, then please do, and we'll get to them later in the discussion. So, to start with, perhaps, Clayton, I could start with you. You have a national role within City Fibre, rather than one that's specific to Bath, but perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourself and to tell us a bit about what you think cutting-edge digital connectivity means for cities such as Bath.
Of course, yeah. So I own strategy for City Fibre. That means, in this particular context, I think about where we roll things out and also the justification for why we do that stuff. The choices as where we go are, line up really closely with the report you put out there, right? We believe in the commercial model. We're bringing our own money, but we also believe that you only go places where you're invited, right? And certainly kind of that private-public kind of interface between ourselves and the council has been one of the reasons that Bath is so attractive for us, right? The council's thinking about this the right way. They know that we're going to bring the investment, but we need some help from them in terms of building out what we're doing. And we've thought really carefully about what fibre, we think very specifically about fixed connectivity in the ground, means both for cities like Bath, but for the country as a whole. And, we're very clear that the network we're going to build is here for 100 years, and it's got to bring value to the society as well as to kind of commercially. And we think it does, right? The UK, Bath, this is a services economy we live in now, and post-Brexit, that's more and more important. That runs on the internet runs on fibre, right? So what we found as we're rolling things out across the country is that it brings jobs, it brings kind of lots of green benefits, We're taking away a bunch of old copper and a lot of power that's consumed everywhere. But also it just means it brings a set of serendipity in terms of commercial opportunity. It's impossible to plan, right, what's going to work. What you need to do is create options for people and allow them to then kind of play on that playground and deliver value through both back to the city, back to the country, and ultimately kind of through the environmental benefits back to kind of, globally fundamentally. So we think it's really important. We think people want it, and we're here to help.
That's great. Thank you, Clayton. I love that idea that the networks that are being built are here for 100 years. That puts a particularly important context onto the work that we're doing. And we'll come back to some of those issues that you raise in the discussion. Emily, from your perspective, I know you work in Brighton, but also all around the country for the Digital Catapult. So what's your sense of what does cutting-edge digital connectivity offer to cities like Bath?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for having me here as well. So, yeah, with Digital Catapult, really our kind of core aim is to join up a lot of the thinking between universities, industries and startups to actually help grow that digital infrastructure and digital application layer across the UK. So for us, when we're talking about smart cities or that, as you say, advanced connectivity within cities, I think it's really important to think about it not just from that core network, but to think about what sits on top. And that's, again, what your report really started to highlight, that, you've got various ways and lenses of looking at this. There's the R&D, a lot of which may be led through the universities, but that in itself is not necessarily going to bring growth to the city. You've then got to think about, okay, what are we going to do with these networks? And that's where you can, divide it up to some of the core industries and how they might adapt, how they might make themselves more efficient, make themselves greener, and of course expand their kind of employment base as well in the local area. And then you've got the thought of looking at it through the consumer guise and how is it going to actually attract new people to come to the city, and what are they going to do when they're here? Because I think the bottom line is people won't come to Bath just because there's a network. We've not demonstrated that in the past at all. But definitely people will come to Bath if there are unique applications, unique businesses, unique entertainment type scenarios that they can come to and enjoy whilst they're here. So I think it's now for Bath and for a lot of the areas that we're starting to work in regards to applied R&D, it's looking at what are we doing with the network and what are the either ROI for business that we're seeing or impact and experience drivers that we're creating for the end user themselves. So yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you a bit more about Brighton maybe later on.
Thanks for that.
So brilliant.
So the network itself is not going to be at the forefront of Bath's tourism offer, but it might enable things that tourists value.
Exactly, that probably feels bold, and I think of course network is number one. You can't start playing until you've got any of those things in originally.
Okay,
yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Emily. So Kate, same question. So you commissioned this work on behalf of the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D programme. So why do you think this sort of cutting-edge network conversation is important to Bath?
Well, I guess the impetus behind the report really was, there's been such a lot of activity in Bristol around thinking about the future of connectivity. They have their own testbed, and a lot of that is driven by the Smart Internet Lab at Bristol University. But the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D Partnership brings the 4 universities and other partners together in the region, and that just kind of crystallized for us the fact that that kind of infrastructure hasn't existed in Bath. It's as the report tells the story, it's come and it's gone again. So we commissioned the report as a way of restarting the conversation, but also we really wanted to hear from creative technology and creative industry businesses in Bath about what they thought Bath needed for the future, for the next 100 years, for the future of connectivity. So that was the kind of impetus from behind the report. And we're talking today from the studio at Palace Yard Mews, which is Bath Spa's innovation and incubation hub, which is the kind of the university's first real step into that kind of initiative in the city. And it's just become more and more apparent to us as we've got to know the creative technology micro-businesses who reside here in the building with us, that issues around connectivity, from the most basic to why can't I get a phone signal in this part of Bath, to the much more the kinds of things that we're talking about here today. But I also think there's a really interesting thing about Bath, which it's a small city in the scale of things, but it's got a lot of very interesting cutting edge creative industries and technologies businesses. So a lot of businesses that are driven by digital, and so it seemed like an opportunity was there for the taking, really, to start to think about what future connectivity would mean. And also that thinking was further developed for me by in a conversation with Emily's boss, Jeremy Silver, who we were talking with about a year and a half ago. And Jeremy said, from his point of view, as someone that hasn't had much to do with Bath, that it seemed to him that Bath was incredibly well placed as a potential leader in a sector that combined heritage and technology, which Jeremy called in this meeting, rather jokingly, Heritech, which I think will probably stick. So I do think that obviously the whole heritage sector in Bath is also inextricably interlinked with tourism. but at the same time, that kind of combined mass, there's real potential there for doing something, you know, really world leading, I think. And it would be great to find ways to make that happen.
Thank you, Kate, and it's great to be kickstarting the conversation. So it's good. Thank you. Simon, so from a council perspective, you're, I know, in charge of sort of economic development and regeneration. Where does this opportunity around cutting-edge digital connectivity sit for you?
Thanks, Stephen. It's, you know, fantastic and timely, and to have this piece of work emerging now. I think it's, you know, just as we embark on understanding how we want to sort of renew our economy, how we want to really accelerate towards a greener and more sustainable future. You know, the provision of a better and higher quality network really for me is around what it facilitates, not what it provides. And what it really should facilitate is a much higher degree of inclusivity across our community, and that's both our business community and our resident community, so that there is greater access to some of that kind of opportunity that perhaps at the moment is in quite a narrow bandwidth within our economy. So there's that platform to sort of think about. It's then the facilitation of the skills needed in a digital world, in a ever increasing digital society where there are significant skills gaps, particularly where we have an aging population demographic, and particularly where we have different areas of deprivation. And whilst they're relatively small in Bath and North East Somerset, they still are there. So, you know, it's what does the opportunity bring? And for me, it's around that opportunity that, as you've said, we've got a great and fantastic and flourishing ability to bring forward entrepreneurial activity and a great startup scene in Bath. But quite often, again, that is contained within quite a narrow part of our economy. And, you know, the opportunity is there to how do we utilise and how do we develop that to support our tourism economy, for example, and transition from particularly for the city, from a high visitor economy with a high degree of retail that is in decline to a much more kind of creative and entrepreneurial sectorised economy that hopefully embraces much more of our population in that activity.
So that's really helpful, and that sense of digital needing to be available to everybody and everybody being able to have the skills and access to use it came through very strongly in the report. Doesn't mean that we can't talk about networks for advanced users, but we can't do that alone. It has to be in the context of how does everybody benefit from this opportunity. So I think that's very helpful. So, panel, I want to go back and pick up on a few of the things that you've said. Clayton, I was interested in your comment about you not seeing this as being something that the market itself can deliver alone, and it being important that you enter into partnerships with the public sector. But tell me a bit more about how that looks for a company like City Fibre. How do you go about creating those partnerships, and what's important in terms of getting them right?
Well, I mean, the key thing is that all these networks, although they're global, they're really very, very local, right? So we spend a lot of time making sure that we're quite close to the council. We know we're going to disturb a few things. We need some permission to do some stuff. So you know, that's going to take 2 or 3 years, and it's important that we all understand where we're trying to end up. And you know, we'll do everything we can to make that simple, but we need the council to help us go through there. It also means that you know, we don't just look to connect consumers and so forth, right? Across the country, we connect hospitals and schools and 5G mobile phone masts and so forth. So it's really about kind of everything that touches people's lives going forward. You know, up in Glasgow, we run all of the connectivity for the hospitals, which is kind of important in the last 18 months, I think. Right.
Pretty important.
So the partnerships at all levels from that point of view. But it's also about kind of agreeing the outcomes that they want. Like Simon's got a really specific vision in terms of what he's trying to do to kind of uplift everybody here. I mean, Bath's a pretty uplifted place already, but it's a great vision, and we want to support all of that. It also means that it's not just about the fibre, right? We have some people who work locally, and they make sure that we're kind of connecting to the community, sponsoring things, helping out in the right places. We're going to be here for a long time, like I said, 100 years. We want to be, friends with everybody.
And from a council perspective, I mean, clearly City Fibre are making a big investment here, which everybody welcomes. But I guess from a council perspective, there's a whole range of different players and providers within this sort of market. Is it how can you? I suppose it's a question for both of you, really. How do we make that a productive conversation? How do we have a conversation with the sector as well as with individual companies? Are there any practices that you've seen anywhere, or any things that you've thought about how that sort of conversation needs to be brokered?
I think there are. Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I mean, there's a role in really understanding one another's business models, to understand what works for the private sector and where it works best and how we deploy that best locally. And I think strong partnerships are formed when you really understand one another's strengths and weaknesses. And back to one of your earlier questions, there are lots of models of delivery, public to private, but actually, what we need to do is understand and play to one another's strengths, ultimately. We're fortunate in that we are well served locally in the market. We have gigabit connectivity already within the city at a kind of market provision level, but it's not consistent, it's patchy. So I think, one of the things we can do is work closely and work in partnership to ensure that we can facilitate access to the best provision, but equally the public sector can support and plug the gaps. And one of our challenges locally is less about the city, but more about the rural economy. We've got a very patchy provision of connectivity across the district. So it's really about understanding and plugging those two things together so that we can complement one another rather than compete.
Okay. Thank you both. I just want to move. So this is sort of about the who almost. It sort of drives and leads the conversations in places. So Emily, one of the models that we sort of observed and talked to sort of colleagues of yours about was this idea of venues or destinations leading this conversation. And there is this small but significant movement around venues and destinations creating their own private networks. Now, and I know you've been involved in a lot of work in Brighton where a sort of network around the Brighton Dome has become a test bed, really. Tell us a bit about what it's like for a venue to be involved in a prominent position.
Absolutely, and I think this is a really strong model to go with. When you've listed out all the models in your report, I think the venue-led approach works very well because and it doesn't necessarily have to be venues, it could be a certain industry sector, but the work that we've been doing down in Brighton is something that was funded as a part of the government grants called 5G Create, and we're actually involved in a few, but the idea of each of them was that they took quite targeted industry areas to then discover the applications around 5G. So another one, for example, is Factory of the Future, and as you can imagine, it's all about looking at what 5G means to a factory environment. But for us, this one was called 5G Festival. And for starters, I think the interesting thing to look at is the different partners involved. So immediately from the outset, it brought together the range of public and private necessities to build up that. So you have obviously Brighton Dome and ourselves coming in as the research technology organisation. Then O2 Telefonica were there as well to provide some of that network. And then you've got Warner Music coming in from the heavy, big kind of industry side and have that capability to kind of continue things as well as a bunch of smaller SMEs. But the project in its outset was there to prove out if you have high-speed connectivity in that kind of a venue, what does it mean to the business model of hybrid events and the way in which we produce events and audio? And what's been fascinating to watch is the fact that with all R&D projects, what we set off to do has been achieved, but then it's also uncovered a whole bunch of new areas that we didn't quite expect that are really exciting as well. So in its outset, it was there to look at what could we do if you had, the pandemic had thrown up this idea of the fact that you might have artists in different locations wanting to perform together or even wanting to rehearse and produce. So could you develop the technology and the application so that if you had a producer in LA and a musician in the UK, they could actually create music that was produced over a low latency network with that high speed interface, so that the audio was perfectly synced, and you could also, what we also looked at was having that kind of immersive visual content layer, so it felt like you are actually performing together. And that bit we've ticked off. It's been really cool. We've been using augmented reality glasses to create the kind of visual interaction. And then the audio bit has been a lot of hard work from the 5G engineers on our side, and a lot of startups as well. But the second bit that I think is really worthwhile that's come out of this is looking at what is the future of audio from live venues when you have it geared with high-speed connectivity. So they've been able to work out that if you can pull the audio, again, super low latency, take it to an off-site studio, remix it into spatial audio, so the kind of Dolby Atmos experience that you're used to hearing in the cinema, and then push that out into people's homes, then you truly start to create this idea of a hybrid music festival experience where you can enjoy those kinds of things that were stripped away from us during the pandemic, basically. So that's created this whole new model and various new startups. I mean, one of the companies involved has created a brand new company within the last 6 months off the back of the R&D project. Dolby, as you can imagine, are quite excited about what they're seeing from it, as are Warner and a whole bunch of the others involved. So it's really, these are the kind of things I mean from the application. Until you start building R&D, but in quite an applied way, then you don't even begin to understand, what some of the new business models might be and what they could mean. And I think, for Bath, there's a lot of excitement, I think, around that same area that could be built upon in terms of the reason that tourists come, what you could build from the heritage sector, and then even probably, again, I'm speaking slightly out of my knowledge area, but equally around that kind of creative media realm and how to build upon the experiences that people get here.
That's really exciting, and I guess if you asked people what they felt cutting-edge connectivity should be used for, they might not start with audio. That might, they might be more likely to start with AR, VR, HD, 360-degree video, but the fact that audio comes through as a real opportunity, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all about, it's about thinking, what do consumers already have access to? The bit that's held back AR and VR is the lack of hardware still in people's homes. But with audio, and there's been loads of big announcements this week, if you looked at it, there's Amazon Music have made some pretty massive announcements all around increasing the access to immersive audio, essentially, along with a load of other players. But yeah, I think that's the point to start at, is kind of what can consumers already access, and how does the connectivity allow them to actually build on those experiences.
That's very exciting.
I think the implications for arts venues as well are just massive when it comes to that, doesn't it? And we've seen that in the pandemic here in Bath as well as in Bristol. So our very small little children's theatre, The Egg, has really made a really remarkable pivot during the pandemic to digital in a way that they'd never really engaged with digital at all before the pandemic. So that there's a really interesting case study there of a significant change which has enabled them to really broaden their reach. Because one of the puzzling things about Bath is that the centre of Bath is wealthy and affluent, but as Simon alluded to, there are lots of pockets in the broader region of the councils, Baines, Bath and North East Somerset, where there's real pockets of deprivation. To be able to use connectivity to take work out of the city centre into the surrounding communities seems to me very exciting and really vital. And then over in Bristol, of course, the Bristol Old Vic suddenly realised there's a potential revenue stream from digital that they had never really thought about before as well. So you know, two local examples, but just really quite significant, I think.
There's a good, and I guess having turned on those streams during the pandemic, it's not really fair to turn them off. You know, not only does it create different innovation opportunities, it reaches out to different audiences who might not physically be able to get to somewhere, or just find it easier to access stuff through a virtual channel. So
Absolutely.
that hybrid opportunity is really quite timely, isn't it?
I'd be quite interested to know less about what the outcomes were, but what are the ingredients as inputs that enable those types of outcomes to flourish? Because I think as a civic provider of services, it's kind of understanding really clearly roles and responsibilities, and understanding, you know, what are the ingredients we're lacking here, and how can we cooperate and work together to ensure that those kind of base building blocks are in place, so that you're not limiting what comes out at the other end. Because I think that would be really interesting to sort of take that learning and apply it and say, okay, from the parties that can get involved point of view, and from the basic kind of requirements that need to be provided to enable that, you know, are we clear on what we can achieve and where we fit together to then ensure that we're providing maximum opportunity for all sorts of things to flourish and flow from it? Because like you say, you've kind of described a vision of how this might be transformational to the visitor economy, for example, if you could share a visitor experience beyond the city limits, so that we didn't have to rely on a continuing conveyor belt of increasing tourism footfall to drive increased sort of opportunity. That would be a great outcome, for example. But just one, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
Who knows?
Without meaning to sort of put you on the spot, and maybe that it's too much detail to go into, but what are the top three ingredients that you felt that it was important to have working together in an example like Brighton?
Example, yeah. Well, I think it is the coming together, I think, of those partners that's really interesting. So the local area authorities for Brighton as well were instrumental in us initially laying in, basically we made the Brighton Dome an R&D testbed, i.e. put in a 5G spectrum with an Ofcom licence down there. So, and the council, I believe it was the council, combined authorities for the area were very involved in doing that and part funding that. But I think, you know, and then as I say, it's, I think, to do with the partners coming together, but around a business challenge. And I really think that's one of the biggest ingredients. And it doesn't matter necessarily what that business challenge is, but knowing what the aim is. So, you know, I think there was the great example that you referenced in the report for the Bath region with the Roman Baths, and that was another great collaborative R&D project. And yet it maybe the bit that kind of got missed was how to take it on to that next step further. And I think that was really trying to understand what the business benefits were for each of the partners involved. And it's, you know, it really is important to draw those out before you dive into the R&D project, I think. And that's where, yes, the universities have got to have their part in driving forward the R&D, but then absolutely industry have got to be there alongside with the public realms as well and the authorities to keep it moving forwards. Otherwise it runs out of steam. And I think that's, you know, something, I've only been at Catapult for 4 years, but it's something that's immediately apparent between what makes a really effective R&D project and what are the ones that sadly have kind of fallen by the wayside when running a student.
Perhaps Clayton and City Fibre might come in, because if you can then pick up and commercialise it, that then gives it the longevity where, for example, public bodies in an enabling capacity, we're there to make it happen. But once you've done that, you sort of, your runway kind of runs out quite quickly. So it kind of demonstrates the case almost that you really need that commercial imperative. You need that kind of, that constant kind of drive to ensure there's an asset value that you can get a return on investment from, as to how you kind of connect those two things together and bring that kind of commercial value to it.
Picking up Simon's comment then, Clayton, so where does City Fibre sit? I mean, do you care what people use the network for, or do you just want them to use it?
We just want them to use it a lot, basically. No, we don't care, right? But we do watch. And, I think to your comment about the theatres and kind of opportunity, it's a bit of a trite thing to say, but the pandemic has changed habits.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that, the things people started during the pandemic have continued. So one thing that happened was, almost 50% of retail moved onto the internet during that process. And it's stayed there. It hasn't dropped off, right? So people who are visiting the theatre remotely, I think they're going to do that, can continue to do that, right? It's created that hybrid model, it's created the opportunity. And that's wonderful, right? The more light we send down the glass, the happier we are.
And that's something actually I'll pick up on there, because you're absolutely right about that shift of retail, and that's another area we've been working on recently. So we've been working with Verizon, again, another telco in the area that are, in the globe, I should say, not in the area, but very interested in looking at private networks again. But they specifically are working with us to try and identify some of the retail applications. So we've partnered up with L'Oreal, Burberry and Diageo to look at, if you had 5G in stores, what does that mean for, exactly as you just described, that combination of kind of bringing together the e-commerce experience and the physical experience. And we've now got a bunch of startups that are kind of developing solutions and testing solutions on the 5G testbed, kind of in answer to those challenges. But I think that's another way to look at it is kind of how can you get some of the technology companies to part fund some of these things, but allow the local startups and the local community to actually be developing some of the solutions that drive it forwards and drive the new applications. Yeah.
I'll come to the audience online in a second and see if there are any questions for our panel. So if you have any, please do post them in the chat box. But just before we get to that, I wondered if, I'm not quite sure who the right person to ask is, but what I've heard is quite a lot that strikes me that this is also about developing new skills, both for businesses who need some help often to understand what these new network technologies offer and perhaps how they need to reconfigure their business model in order to make best use of them. But we've also heard, particularly from Simon, about the fact that there are people and communities in the city that are a way away from advanced networks and need help to get onto those sorts of first rungs. I don't know, where does this sort of skills, opportunity and agenda around digital sort of fit within Bath at the moment? I appreciate it might not be your portfolio, Simon, but what's your sense of where is it now? Is it high on people's agenda?
Hugely so, yeah. I mean, acutely so, given the end of furlough and the impact on the kind of hospitality sector locally. So it's front and centre of both funding from central government and the conversation that we have with businesses locally. We're working with the universities. There's a lot of boot camp kind of offers being put out into the market, particularly around digital and 3D skills at the moment. So we're running boot camps locally. The other things we've been running, which was a local pilot, was midlife MOTs. So with an aging population, it sounds like
where do you sign up?
Yeah, well, I can send you the details, Stephen. But they're hugely successful around people's ability to access kind of probably lower level digital skills, but give them a sense that they can repurpose their career and experience into something that's much more for a digital future. And that we ran a pilot in the southwest here that's been taken up nationally actually for midlife MOTs, which has been great. And another area is the Women's Work Lab program that we've been running as well. So there's been a program of Women's Work Labs, which has been about getting women that perhaps into a second career, that either coming back from having a family, wanting to go back into the workforce, but struggling to find the access and skills and the employers to support them to do that. So that's another program. So I think there's for me it's both, it's three-dimensional almost, but it's about extending the capability vertically and broadening the base horizontally. So we need to increase the capability and the technical opportunity vertically about developing newer and higher digital skills, but at the same time we need to broaden the base as well. And the backbone of all of that, I guess, is having the fibre
Absolutely, but
big enough to be able to do it.
Well, I'm really interested in your point about just basic skills, right? We ran this experiment as a kind of a globe, really. 18 months ago, we kind of threw everybody in the home and said, "Here's a Zoom link. I'm sure you'll figure that out, right?" And we kind of got by. I mean, everyone managed to get online, and my son ran behind me in a number of meetings, not wearing very many clothes and so forth. And at one point, climbed out of the window, and it all worked. But what we found, even internally, was just at that level, there's a lot you could teach our own employees about just doing that better, right? And kind of interacting online in different ways. So,
and when we embarked on the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D program 2.5 years ago, we had assumed that there would be a lot of interest from the companies we were working with, from the SMEs, the small companies we were working with, on future connectivity, and that we'd get projects coming through that were about future connectivity, and we haven't, which is part of why we've commissioned this report in particular, is because I think the level of knowledge, even in digital media businesses, about future connectivity is sometimes quite low. So that's another kind of complicating factor.
Do you think there's, what more can we do to help those businesses sort of up their knowledge and skills? Is it case studies? Is it informal opportunities to learn? What's your sense?
I think all of that kind of thing. Yeah. I think really just foregrounding the conversation and getting people talking about it, hearing about examples like what Emily's talking about in Brighton. Just more conversation, more discussion, and more kind of future dreaming about what we might want to do with the technology, how to make the world better through the potential of digital connectivity.
Yeah, it is interesting, that kind of the case study you said about a sort of a private network, and some of this is about networks as well. It's about having the visibility, and we've got a great kind of creative tech sector network in Bath, really flourishing, very very active in our business community, and it's about trying to ensure that that network can broaden itself out and transfer some of those skills to other sectors and other business opportunities, but also then perhaps develop and extend their skill sets further into more innovative, cutting edge kind of technologies that kind of bring new opportunities.
I was going to, sorry, I'll add one more thing to that, because I think the thing I've noticed as well is that the real expertise around network and networking is still so based within the academic layer. The majority of our 5G technology team at Digital Catapult are ex-academia and are very involved with that kind of R&D territory. And part of the work that they do with a variety of programs is taking startups through the test beds to understand, okay, if you're coding for a 5G or a high connectivity network, what does that actually mean to your code? And I think that's a really important bit that we're only actually, I think actually for some of our 5G technologists, it's probably not that complicated, but for the average person, even if you're a developer, it is complicated, and it's a different thing that you don't think about encoding for, because when you're just making it for today's network, that's what you've learned. So I think there's some immediate steps that you can look at almost as to how do you just prepare the average developer who is already in situ in jobs in the area to take that advanced level, but then equally, as you say, at the kind of entry level, how do we just get more people that are ready to fill those digital gaps that we're seeing across a whole range of industries?
Pipeline. One of the most interesting conversations I've had around the uses of sort of advanced networks recently was in relation to a project I was working on or am working on with the University of Bristol's Smart Internet Institute and Dimitris Simonadou. And this idea was to create a nomadic network, so a portable, advanced 4, 5, 6G network. And my role was to go out to talk to a number of community organisations in Bristol about what they would do with that network if it was available to them. And the best conversation was when I went to a workshop with an organisation called BASA, who work with young black people in St Paul's in Bristol. And I explained what the network was, and they all got sort of, reasonably excited. But then half of the group arrived late, and the group of the young people who were there explained to their peers what this network could do. And at that point, they all got really excited. So there's something in that that sort of reminds us that it's important who's telling the stories. And if people are telling the stories to each other and to their communities and sort of inspiring them to get involved, that's another way of bringing new people into that conversation, I guess. So, are there any questions either from our COVID-friendly small audience within the room, or for our even more COVID-friendly audience online? Are there any questions that we can consider?
Yeah, we've got one from Chris, who says, how much of a focus is accessibility within a highly connected world? For example, price point for high-speed connections, but also knowledge on the advantages of higher speeds.
Clayton, how do you as a sort of company think about this? How do you work out where to peg the value proposition to different types of users?
Look, we want everybody to be connected, so we're pitching our price points, and it's important to understand we sell to people who then create a product. So the various ISPs are the people who are wrapping the stuff up. But we're at a point where we're cheaper fundamentally than any other network in the country for ridiculously high speeds. Right? We only sell gigabit connectivity. That said, there's still a kind of strata of society who struggle at that level, and we're looking pretty deeply at what we do about that sort of social tariff. The UK is fairly well connected. About 93% of homes in this country have some form of internet connectivity, right? Only 7% don't have a fixed connection of some description. So people do this, but we also know that the internet is so important that people tend to eat less in order to pay for the internet, right? So it is at the most basic level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's kind of internet, food, and ultimately at the end, self-actuation.
Yeah.
We don't want people to make that trade-off, right? So we're that's
not if you want to keep them as customers.
So we're trying really hard to make sure that kind of the people at the edge there are plugged in because they're all part of this process as well.
Yeah. Were there any other questions from the web?
Yeah,
from
we've
the
got
room?
one more from Jonathan.
Thank you for that, by the way. Yeah. Jonathan,
who says, is there a need for a kind of digital ethics which would encourage users to make the most of digital and tech's ability to have positive social and or environmental impacts? If so, how do we create or co-create this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Theo Blackwell, who's the Chief Digital Officer for London, has recently published a sort of a tech charter for London, which establishes some broad principles about how tech and innovation and I guess data as a product of that will be, or the aspiration about how it would be used within the city. So it's an attempt to create a framework. But I mean, Emily, does this figure in your work at all?
Yeah, I mean,
do people raise the sort of ethics?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's always going to be a really big element of as we progress with digital. And for us as Digital Catapult, the ethics around artificial intelligence has been one of the main focus areas. So we have a whole ethics committee and have driven various reports out of that. And it has to be said, I believe that the UK, certainly around AI, the UK's standpoint is one of the more ethical within the global sphere. But there's tons to be done, as we see every day with all the whistleblowing that comes out of the major social networks. So I think the answer is yes, it's absolutely crucial. I think there's loads of, all of these developing areas have still got questions every day that aren't answered, particularly, again, with immersive and the ethics, and a lot of that with immersive content as well is going to keep developing as it goes further into the consumer sphere basically. So yeah, I think the short answer is there's definitely lots already published. There's lots of ethics groups out there, but it will be a chicken and egg, I think, as to standardising what the baselines are. But I imagine, Kate, you've got work on this as well, right?
Yeah, no, it's a huge question, and it seems to me that the most important thing is that anybody thinking about ethics has to come at it from an inclusive point of view. You have to think about who's being left out of the conversation from the very beginning. Otherwise, you end up with ethics committees that have, that are just talking amongst a very small cohort of people. And I think a lot of the problems that have arisen out of in the last 20 years have arisen because the type of people who are in the conversations is just way too narrow, and that. What you were talking about earlier with Stephen, with your example, and what we've been talking about with digital skills and inclusivity is really the ethics conversation won't have any meaning unless a lot of different types of people are in that conversation.
That's so true. Yeah, diversity and ethics basically go hand in hand.
They absolutely go hand in hand, and all too often they're seen as an add-on or as something that you have to do because you've been told you have to do it, like brushing your teeth, or well, no, we all brush our teeth, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's probably important not to, and try embed it within the conversation around both the infrastructure provision and its deployment and use. So organisationally, you can take a role, can't you, in terms of applying some ethics to your contribution to the provision, be it equality of access or discrimination, ensuring that you're non-discriminatory in the ability for people to utilise what you do. But I think the most important thing, by virtue of the question, is don't divorce that conversation from the conversation around, what is it we're trying to, the aims point, what is it we're trying to deliver, how are we going to do it, and who's doing it.
We're coming up soon to our time, and I'm going to ask each of our panel one final question before we finish. But just before I get to that, Clayton, when you introduced City Fibre earlier, you mentioned environmental aspects, and I think the question from Jonathan on the web was about both the ethics and sort of environmental impact. Is that something that City Fibre seriously sort of looks at in terms of the network?
Extremely, right? And not just the environmental, but just kind of the whole responsible business piece about what we do. I mean, if you look at kind of where we consume electricity in this country, the second largest consumer of electricity is the incumbent telephone company, right? There are 35 million copper lines powered 24 hours a day, right? The only people who use more electricity are the railways. Wow. Right?
You mean the landlines?
Landlines consume...
Which no one uses anymore.
Landlines consume almost 1% of the electricity in this country. Right?
Blimey.
And although our electricity
there's nothing you can do to turn it off in your household either.
No, you can't, otherwise it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
I know we've gotten greener in terms of power consumption, but that's still terrifying. I'd love to get rid of 1% of the power consumption, right? And so quite naturally, it's just using kind of passive glass. All that goes away, right? But also, once you start enabling people to work from home, you get all those other spillover benefits. People travel less. Or, when they travel, they do it deliberately. They're kind of get much richer experiences and so forth. So, yeah, we take that pretty seriously.
Good. Thank you for picking up on that. And the power consumption of the idle copper network is something that I will definitely throw into presentations and conversations in future. So thank you for that.
Kind of puts in context your kind of, I'll turn the television off at night, right? It's sort of in the meanwhile on the wall.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we are reaching the end of what I think has been a very interesting discussion. So thank you. But before we close, I always like to finish these types of panels with a sort of thought about what do we do, what's practical, what's important to do next. So I'm just going to invite each of the panel to say, well, what would be a good priority for Bath or cities like Bath to be focusing in on, say, in the next 3 years? Simon, what would be a good thing? What would be on your wish list if we said we could do something together in that sort of time frame?
I'd probably start with the skills discussion and the skills piece, because it's very front and centre now, so I think that's important. But I think the other piece that's perhaps more relevant to today's discussion about, particularly about the infrastructure and about kind of digital connectivity and digital capacity, is be really clear on what it is, work together to be really clear on what the intervention is that we want to achieve. Because I think if we can have the clarity of that, it's much easier for, you know, the likes of City Fibre to actually get the investment model right and then get it rolled out quickly. So I think that for me probably is the relevant piece for the conversation today.
So upfront investment in that sort of planning, collaboration, joint thinking in order to then be able to move forward. That's good. Clayton, what from your perspective is you know important for us to be getting right in the next 3 years?
I think the last 18 months has taught us that you can't kind of rely on anything anymore, right? The foundations upon which we stand are shaky. And although, you know, we're all hoping that we come out of this thing in a sensible place, who knows what the future holds for us, right? So connect everybody, create that opportunity for serendipity, for creativity, and do it really quickly, I think, right? And, you know, we love what, you know, the way Bath Council thinks about this stuff. They're really trying to solve some real problems. They think about, you know, the people in the city and the surrounds as customers, you know, trying to deliver a value. And, you know, we find it's a great place, and we're going to hurry up and do this as fast as we can.
Very good. I've really missed serendipity. So
it's a great word, isn't it?
I know. Let's hope it comes back full force very soon. Emily, from a Catapult perspective, or from your perspective, what do you think?
I think my perspective is that no one city needs to do it all. So Bath doesn't need to do it all. You know, in your report you laid out the kind of, I think it was 5 or 6 different ways of doing this. And my perspective would be, if there's bits that the university have strength on, chase those. So, for example, you know, Bristol at the moment is the one that's seen as having the network R&D capability. Great, let them do it. Bath, therefore, should take up on, in my head, as I said, kind of the application side, the plugging in of the creative networks. And I'd say, you know, choose a couple of application areas to really focus on, and maybe with one of those being the kind of fundamental city infrastructure and the IoT, as well as then a couple of, you know, venue or individual industry use cases, and really kind of focus on driving what the real business opportunities are around those, and what the feedback is around those. And I think that's the way to get to the next step quite quickly and with quite clear, you know, impacts that can be seen. To then scale up. But yeah, definitely don't panic about needing to do everything, because I don't think any one place can.
I think that's very helpful advice, and that idea of some form of complementary specialism within a region of the size of the west of England, I guess also has the benefit that from a combined authority perspective, it makes it then much easier to work out what the ask is of government or of industry at a bigger scale.
Yeah, that's very true.
So that's a very useful point. Thank you. So finally, Kate, what's top of your list in terms of what we ought to be aspiring to in the next few years?
Well, I guess really continuing the conversation, to continuing make the conversation happen. Really support the conversation, but also I think that the city is my understanding is that it's a moment at which the city is looking again at the economic renewal and recovery plan, and that the conversation about the future networks should be part of that, and can contribute to what happens next for Bath, really.
Very good. Thank you, panel. I'm going to invite our very small audience to give our panel a round of applause. So just to say thank you. So thank you to the Bath Digital Festival, of which this event is part. And particularly thank you to Abby and the team at the studio here for helping us do this live online broadcast, which has been a great experience all round. So thank you, panel, thank you, audience, and we look forward to connecting Bath. Thank you.